The third death. Script, there's an old idea, quiet and strange, that says every person dies not once, but 3 times. The first death is when your heart stops. The second is when your body is lowered into the ground. But the third death, the one almost nobody talks about, happens later, sometimes decades later. The moment someone says your name out loud for the very last time, almost everyone has heard some version of this idea. Yet very few people ever stop to ask whether it's actually true, or what it might reveal about how memory really works. Is this just a poetic saying, something comforting to repeat at funerals? Or is there something measurable, even scientific, behind the idea that we eventually vanish not just physically, but from human memory itself? By the end of this video, you'll understand why this third death is almost mathematically guaranteed, and why, strangely enough, that might not be the tragedy it first appears to be. Let's start with what's actually happening across generations. Researchers studying family memory and oral history have noticed a consistent, almost universal pattern. Detailed, personal memory of a specific individual tends to survive roughly 3 generations after their death. Your grandchildren might remember your voice, your habits, the way you laughed. Your great-grandchildren might know your name and a story or two. But by the 4th generation, the individual dissolves into something more abstract. A name on a family tree, a photograph nobody can quite place, a fact rather than a person. One of the most fascinating explanations for this pattern comes down to something researchers call living memory. Living memory refers to first-hand experience, someone who actually knew you, heard your voice, watched you move through a room. Once every person who held that first-hand experience has also died, what remains isn't memory anymore. It's second-hand information, a story about a story, gradually thinning with each retelling until there's almost nothing left to hold on to. So how do we know this pattern holds up? Genealogists and oral historians studying multi-generational families have found remarkably consistent results. Specific personality traits, voice, humor, small daily habits are almost never accurately preserved past the 3rd generation, even in families that actively try to pass down stories. The facts survive: birth dates, occupations, causes of death, but the actual texture of who they were, fades first. Psychologists point to a related mechanism in how human memory itself is built. Memory isn't a filing cabinet of untouched facts, it's a reconstructive process, rebuilt slightly differently every single time it's recalled. When you tell a story about your grandmother, you're not replaying a recording, you're rebuilding an approximation, and small details shift with every retelling. Multiply that natural drift across 2 or 3 generations of retelling, and the original person becomes almost unrecognizable. A composite sketch built from fragments rather than a preserved photograph. This experience varies quite a bit depending on circumstance. Some people are remembered vividly for far longer, especially if they left behind detailed writing, recordings, or if their life intersected with historical events. Others fade almost immediately, sometimes within a single generation. And here's a question worth asking: if this fading is so consistent, why does it feel so unsettling to think about? Because most of us instinctively want continuity, some sense that who we are will matter, will persist, long after we're gone. The idea that even the people who loved us most will eventually stop being able to picture our face clearly touches something deeply uncomfortable about the limits of human memory itself. Today, this pattern plays out in nearly every family, whether people realize it or not. Most people can name their grandparents. Fewer can describe their great-grandparents in any real detail. Go back one more generation, and for most families, the names alone survive, disconnected from any real sense of personality. Stripped down to dates and locations on a family tree. So is there anything that changes this timeline? It largely comes down to how much of a person gets externalized before living memory runs out. Journals, letters, recorded stories, and detailed family conversations don't stop the third death entirely, but they do delay it, sometimes significantly, by transferring fragments of a personality into a form that outlives first-hand memory. The people who are remembered longest usually aren't the most famous. They're simply the ones who left behind the most detail for others to hold on to. Now imagine, for a moment, every single person who has ever lived, quietly moving through these 3 stages: the body's death, the burial, and finally, the fading of the name itself. Billions of complete, complicated human lives, full of secrets, achievements, mistakes, and private thoughts, have already reached that third and final death, dissolved so completely that no living person could describe them even if they tried. But let's go even deeper. Because there's a strange, almost paradoxical comfort hidden inside this idea, one that becomes clearer the longer you sit with it. If every embarrassing mistake, every private shame, every argument and regret a person carried through life eventually fades along with their name, then the third death isn't only an ending, it's also a kind of release. The specific details of who wronged whom, who felt humiliated at a party 50 years ago, who made a choice they regretted for decades, none of it survives the erosion of living memory either. Time doesn't just erase the good, it erases the judgment too. The pace of this fading can also be influenced by cultural and technological factors. How much a society values record keeping, whether photographs and recordings exist, and how tightly knit the family or community structure is. On a more technical level, some researchers connect this pattern to what's sometimes called cultural memory decay. The idea that any piece of information not actively reinforced through retelling, writing, or ritual naturally erodes over time, following a predictable curve, rapid loss of detail early on, followed by a long, slow fade of whatever fragments remain. Here's a striking way to think about scale. Historians estimate that over 100 billion people have lived and died throughout human history. The overwhelming majority of them, kings and farmers alike, are now completely unknown. Not because their lives lacked meaning, but simply because living memory, by its very nature, cannot stretch indefinitely. Even people who were once locally famous, respected, or influential in their own communities have, in the vast majority of cases, already passed through their third death without anyone noticing the exact moment it happened. Going back to the deeper mechanism at play, imagine memory as a kind of inheritance, passed from person to person, but slightly diminished with every handoff. Like a photograph copied from a copy again and again, until the image softens into something less specific, less detailed, more of an impression than a portrait. What's especially interesting is that this isn't a flaw in how humans remember, it's simply the mathematics of finite attention meeting infinite generations. No culture, no matter how devoted to ancestry or record keeping, has ever fully escaped this pattern. Some researchers believe this natural fading may even serve a quiet evolutionary function, allowing each generation to focus its limited cognitive and emotional resources on the living, rather than carrying the full emotional weight of every person who came before them, beyond individual families. This same pattern shows up at a cultural scale too. Entire communities, professions, and even languages fade in strikingly similar ways, suggesting that this three-stage erosion of memory may be a fundamental feature of how human societies process time and continuity. Not just something that happens within a single family tree. It's a small but powerful example of how consistently this pattern repeats itself, regardless of how important a person or a culture once believed itself to be. If you want to sit with this idea for yourself, try naming your own great-great-grandparents. For most people, that's already impossible, not because those lives didn't matter, but because 4 generations is usually enough to erase even a name. Just don't let that realization tip into despair. Understanding this pattern isn't meant to diminish your life. It's meant to reframe what actually matters within it. The people you're present for right now, rather than the abstract hope of being remembered by people who haven't been born yet. Here's a fascinating detail from across history and culture. Many ancient traditions, from ancestor veneration practices to formal genealogical record keeping, developed specifically as attempts to fight this exact pattern. Rituals designed to keep a name spoken, a story retold, a memory active for as long as humanly possible. And yet even the most devoted genealogical traditions in history still show the same basic decay curve. Proof that this isn't a failure of love or effort, it's simply the shape of memory itself. One that no culture has ever fully outrun. So the next time you think about being forgotten, remember, it's not a unique fate reserved for the unremarkable. It's the same third death that eventually comes for everyone, quietly closing the book on every argument, every regret, and every small private shame, right alongside every joy, leaving behind only the people you touched while you were here to touch them. If you found this fascinating, stick around for more strange and surprising stories about the human mind, and the quiet patterns shaping the life you're living right now.